Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Under the cover of darkness, the soldier, dressed in black, stealthily exited the forest. His stride betrayed a confidence. This was a solo mission, but one he'd prepared for and had successfully executed many times before. He'd parked his van miles away from the target, then hopped on a motorbike. It was street legal, but designed for off-roading. He traveled undetected to the 2-mile checkpoint designated on his map. He stashed the bike in the woods near his cache of supplies, which contained his gear and weapon. He walked the rest of the way through the darkened trees. He'd been trained in the Army's Special Forces, and even though it was pitch black, he was an expert in wilderness survival, a master of weaponry, and accomplished in martial arts. He could handle anything that came his way, and he was prepared. From his orienteering expertise, he'd done his homework, studied the maps. He knew every nook and cranny of those woods, the streams, old railroad tracks, until he arrived at his destination, exactly where he needed to be, at exactly the moment he needed to be there. That's when he left those woods. It was cold outside, freezing, but at the same time, his heart was pounding with the thrill of the mission. The area was rural, but there were still people around, but he was so good no one noticed him as he silently made his way towards the target. He had studied the habits of the people inside of the building. He looked at his watch. It was just a few minutes before 7 o'clock on that Friday night. He knew the employees would be inside thinking about the weekend, excited to get off their shift. It was just a few minutes before closing time when they would lock up the doors and set the alarm. For him, it was go time. He slipped his hand inside of his bag. He pulled out his mask, his favorite, Freddy Krueger. When he put it on, he became completely anonymous, and it always aroused the desired effect. Instant terror. He thrust open the doors, brandishing his weapon as he shouted, "This is a bank robbery."
That's why the book is called 30 Years on the Run, The Hunt for the Most Prolific Bank Robber in History. And he was. He robbed more banks than John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, all them combined.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 134, part 2 of The Unmasking. Now, if you haven't already, go to episode 133 in our Criminal Mischief podcast feed and listen to that first, or head on over to our YouTube channel and watch it there. But to recap, after a 14-year search for an elusive thief known only as the Friday Night Bank Robber, who, even after 27 bank heists, was still a total mystery, now retired FBI agent and profiler Ray Carr was called in to assist. He was asked to develop a criminal profile of the unknown suspect. The only thing he had to work with? Each robbery from 1988 to 2002 had these things in common. The heists happened between the months of April and October, just before the bank was about to close, typically on a Friday night, when the suspect stormed into the bank wearing baggy clothes, a Halloween or ski mask, carrying a bag slung over his shoulder, and a gun in his hand. He immediately gained control of the bank by vaulting onto the teller counter, then hopped down and began removing the cash himself. And within 2 minutes, he was gone, fleeing into the darkness of the nearby woods. All the banks he hit were in remote areas, and in the 14 years that they believed he'd been robbing banks, the only identifying description an eyewitness had been able to make out was that he had brown eyes. But Ray caught a break when 2 teenagers found a bunker in the woods.
I get a call from a PD, Radnor, Pennsylvania, which is right where Villanova University is. And he says, "Hey, Ray," he says, "are you busy this morning? It's 8 o'clock in the morning." And I says, "No, what do you got?" He says, "We found something. We think it's either a white right wing or left wing group. We found a bunker in the woods next to the PD. We're not sure what we have."
In this bunker, they found documents related to a chain of karate studios. Ray goes to pay a visit at a dojo closest to where the teens had found the bank robbers' stash of guns, masks, maps, and documents. He would describe a profile of the Friday night bank robber to the owners.
This guy's anywhere from 5'4" to 5'8". He's probably in his late 40s to early 50s at this point. He has a fascination with guns. He probably has military experience, and a couple other things. And I said, "Does this reflect anybody? And if he works, he probably works with numbers." And they go, "Well, that sounds like Carl Gugasian." And I says, "Oh." And I said, "Well, what's Carl do for a living?" He says, "He's a statistician." So he says he comes in here all the time. He comes into this dojo. He works out here. He's a second-degree black belt in karate. So he's very, very adept at doing what he does. So I said, "Okay."
The owners of the dojo aren't told why they want to speak to Carl Gugasian. In fact, they are asked not to tell Gugasian about their visit to the studio.
We go back to the Pennsylvania State Troop Barracks and we run up Carl Gugasian. And I come up with, he's got a couple pinches for theft, shoplifting, things of that nature. And he has one thing where he was arrested as a juvenile and he spent time in Camp Hill. And Camp Hill is now a state correctional facility for adults, but at the time it was a juvenile facility when Carl was younger. And inside of the bunker were these documents that says Camp Hill yearbooks that were located in this bunker, so I'm thinking, I said, this is our guy.
When they first found the bunker, Ray had sent some documents from inside of it to the crime lab for prints. But they'd been so backed up and hadn't gotten to it yet. Now that he had a suspect.
So I called down to the FBI lab and I says, "I need you to run the prints that you discovered, or I need you to pull a print and I need you to run them against Carl Gugasian." It comes back, the laboratory comes back and says, "You get a match on the prints of Carl Gugasian."
Ray did a complete background check on Carl. His address and employment history, military records, everything. And that's when he discovered that not too long after the bunker had been found by those teenagers, Carl had moved into a new apartment. The timing was interesting because before that, Carl lived across the street from the park in Radnor where the first bunker had been found. Ray went to speak to the management at that apartment building.
I said, "Hi, my name's Ray Carr with the FBI, and there's 3 young girls." And they were all giddy, like, "Oh my God, I never met an FBI agent before." And we're talking, and I says, "I want to talk to you about the individual who lives in apartment 119. And they said, "We knew it." I said, "You knew what?" He said, "He was CIA, right?" And I said, "No, no." He said, "Well, then he was in the witness protection program, right?" I said, "No." I said, "Why do you?" He says, "He was really weird. He didn't say much, didn't talk much."
One of the women commented that Carl often jogged a lot, but the way that he did it was weird. Fully clothed and carrying a full backpack. And he did this a lot. Other neighbors were interviewed and said the same thing, that they'd seen him running fully clothed while carrying a backpack. Investigators also learned that, according to these neighbors, Carl didn't encourage interaction and that he often left the complex in his red van and was gone for days. A lot of people they spoke to felt that he had money because he didn't appear to work and he wore outdoorsy clothes. A 30-person task force had been assembled to investigate Carl Gugasian as their prime suspect in the Friday night bank robberies. But even with the bunker and the matched fingerprints from those karate flyers that had been found inside of the cache, and also his connection to Camp Hill, getting an arrest warrant wasn't a slam dunk.
And now we're watching Carl, and he goes to the park, and he's working on his karate moves. And we're following him around, just doing general surveillance, waiting for the right time. I'm still putting the case together because pretty much at this point, it's mostly circumstantial. Yeah, there's things in the bunker, but how could we really tie it back? So I'm working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to put this together for him.
And then 9/11, the day terrorists hijacked 4 airline jets and crashed them into the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania.
So 9/11 happens and everything in the FBI stops. And everything is all energies and all everything is directed towards 9/11 and doing interviews and things of that nature. So every other case takes a back seat.
A few months after 9/11, Ray is able to get the case going again, or at least tried to, because in the back of his mind, he's terrified the Friday night bank robber will strike again. One of the robberies they believed was attributed to him. He'd actually shot someone in the stomach. The bank employee would survive, but now that they had a suspect, they needed to get him behind bars.
Just before the end of the year, I talked U.S. Attorney into indicting 5 cases, 5 bank robbery cases, which are the only ones that were still within the statute of limitations against this guy, Carl. And we're just sitting on those things. We have them sealed. We're not doing anything yet because we're waiting for things to die down and get things right. And surveillance teams, we have surveillance teams working on the anthrax down in Miami and all over the place. So we don't really, agents are dispersed all over the place. Some are up at Ground Zero, some are down at Pentagon, some are out in Western Pennsylvania.
Ray mentioned the anthrax case. What he's referring to is that a week after 9/11, letters laced with anthrax spores started arriving at media companies and congressional offices. This was an unprecedented time when resources were stretched so thin that even though they had a suspect and the go-ahead for an indictment, until they had the manpower to fully bring together the case, Ray's hands were tied. So there was literally nothing he could do when in January of 2002, the statute of limitations, which is 5 years on bank robberies, had run out on 2 of the 5 remaining prosecutable robberies attributed to the Friday night bank robbers' heists over the last 14 years.
That was it. It was just a wait and see game. And we didn't have the manpower. Even could we have put the manpower together to go out and do the arrest? Yeah. We could have pulled different agencies and things of that nature, but it just, U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't ready. There was a lot of terrorism related activity going on, cases coming up with those individuals. So there was all kinds of stuff going on. It was as much a cluster as you can think during that time period. Everything was just heightened.
4 days after the statute of limitations expired on 2 of those 5 cases, the Friday night bank robber struck again, running out of the door and into the darkness with more than $22,000.
Another bank gets hit. It's out in Harrisburg area. And I know right away, they called me on Monday and I knew right away it was him. But we just couldn't put anything to him. We didn't have we didn't have the team to put surveillance on him. So I talked to the U.S. attorney. I said, look, we need to move on this guy before he hurts somebody. We know who he is. And if he hurts somebody, we're going to be liable. And they actually agreed with it.
It just so happened that Carl's new apartment was centrally located to the banks the Friday night bank robber targeted. A 90-minute drive west to Harrisburg, New Jersey was an hour to the east, and roughly an hour and a half to the Pocono Mountains. Ray was putting the finishing touches on a search warrant for Carl Gugasian's apartment in Pennsylvania, his rented storage facility, as well as his red van and BMW, when the Friday night bank robber hit another bank just a week after his last heist.
So we're getting things ready, and I'm working on a search warrant for his home and on his vehicles. And the very next Friday night, he hits again. This time he hits up in New Hope, Pennsylvania. And we alerted everybody, hey, if you get a bank robbery, call me right away so we can get on this guy. And I never got the call. So he got about $80,000 that night.
The following Tuesday morning, 2 FBI SWAT teams in unmarked vehicles with blacked out windows were inconspicuously parked near his apartment.
We have one SWAT team at his apartment, and we put another SWAT team in the back of a panel van. So we have our red and blue teams, and I'm running the command post, telling people, barking out directions.
Based on what they knew about Carl Gugasian, they were not going to arrest him at his apartment, where he would have a tactical advantage.
He was special forces within the military, but then he has his second-degree black belt. He has proficiency with weapons. So I said, I don't think it's a good idea to go in. I says, I'm sure that he's well-versed that if somebody comes in and he's threatened, I says, somebody's going to get hurt, either him or one of you guys.
The plan was to wait for him to leave his apartment, then follow him and arrest him on the street. It was overcast that morning, February 7th, 2002, When Carl Gugasian emerged from his apartment, he walked to his red 1991 BMW, got behind the wheel, and began driving out of the parking lot in his apartment complex. He had no idea that he was being followed by a contingent of highly trained operatives. However, his first stop was at a bank.
We're on him, and he goes to a bank at like 9:15, and they say, "Hey, Ray," I get on the radio. They says, "He's walking to the bank. Do we take him down?" I says, "No, no, no, not yet." I says, "He's not going to rob the bank. That's his bank. It was a PNC bank. That's his bank. He's just going to do banking business."
He runs a few more errands before driving to a library, something they'd observed him doing many times before when he was under surveillance.
Philadelphia Free Public Library, which is where he made copies of all these topographical maps of all the areas of the bank. So he would pull a topographical map of banks in Connecticut, of banks in Pennsylvania, and he's looking for the area around the bank so he could effectuate his escape.
The moment Carl steps out of his car, he is swarmed by a SWAT team, suited up in dark green gear, bulletproof vests, and helmets. Carl is forced to the ground, where he's handcuffed and bum rushed into the rear of a van, then whisked away in a matter of seconds. 56-year-old Carl Gugasian didn't say a word, but his facial expressions revealed a mixture of shock and disbelief.
This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally, yes.
It's an absolute riot, and the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time. What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out of touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
Gugasian was taken to the federal building as a search warrant is being executed on his apartment.
And as soon as they walk into his home, the SWAT team, right at the front door, there's a weapon. And in two other places, there's weapons, one in the kitchen, one in his bedroom, that are strategically placed. Should he be accosted or something of that nature, he'd be able to attach those weapons. He's extremely well organized, just like he was in his bunkers.
A search of Gugasian's van revealed a Yamaha motorcycle standing in an upright position, secured by straps on the interior walls of the van's cargo area. There was a piece of a metal gutter which had been retrofitted to be used as a ramp, presumably to roll the bike in and out of the van. After a 14-month investigation, Ray was chomping at the bit to interrogate the man he believed was the Friday night bank robber, Carl Gugasian, who, when he was arrested, was wearing khaki pants, a long-sleeve shirt, and sneakers. He was around 5'6" and weighed about 155 pounds. He had black hair and owlish brown eyes behind his prescription glasses. He looked like an accountant.
And I look at him and I'm thinking, this is him? I says, wow, I was totally disarmed.
You knew that he was going to be between 5'4" and 5'8". You
Mhm.
knew that he was going to have some martial arts training and
Mhm.
weapons training. You didn't know exactly what. Why was it surprising when you saw him that he wasn't what you expected?
When I spoke to him, he spoke with such a soft-spoken voice. Like if I'm speaking to you and I speak very low and I'm not, he didn't seem like he was confrontational. You know, I've arrested hundreds of bank robbers in my career and hundreds of drug dealers and terrorists and all these people. And this guy was probably the most meek looking individual I ever ran into. Not what I expected. So I sat down and I said, hey, Carl, I says, you know why you're here? And he says, I want to speak to my lawyer. So at that point it stops. So I says, that's fine, Carl. As I leave, I'm going to say, hey, Carl, you're not talking to me today, but you will talk to me. It may not be today, may not be tomorrow, but you're going to talk to me down the road. I promise you that.
Ray wasn't wrong. At first, Carl Gugasian pleaded not guilty, but the evidence they had against him was overwhelming.
The attorney says to me, he says, Ray, Carl wants to talk to you, because what was happening here, if he would have been convicted for each bank robbery with a gun, the first robbery with a gun, there's a mandatory minimum of 7 years. Every subsequent robbery is 25 years. So we have 5 robberies. So he's looking at 107 years plus the bank robberies. He was looking at about 140 years, which is a life sentence for him. And there's guidelines. There's not much you can do in the federal system. You can't plead down or things of that nature. It is what it is. He knew that. So he thought, what can I do to do this? So at the time, he's like 56 years old, 55, 56. So he decides to cooperate.
Carl took the prosecution up on a proffer agreement. He pleaded guilty to 5 robberies. But the deal was he wouldn't be sentenced until after he came clean about his crimes, which meant if he was extremely helpful to the prosecution, he might just have a chance of getting out of prison one day.
He was hoping that if he were to talk to me and cooperate, that what they could do is they would enter what's called a C plea. And what a C plea is when the government and the defense come together, and they come together on a recommended sentence for what's this individual's done. And now the judge, the federal judge, who was Judge Brody at the time in Philadelphia, she has the opportunity to either accept that C plea or say, I'm not accepting it. You do what you want. This is what I think he should get. So it's a chance, but it's better than 140 years.
So what was the C plea? What was he think? What had you guys determined?
They came up with 17 and a half years.
In February of 2003, the day finally came when Carl sat down with Ray. It would be the first of many interviews to come. But the very first thing Carl said to Ray absolutely shocked him. Carl said that he'd committed his first robbery as an adult in the early 1970s, which meant he'd been successfully robbing banks not for 15 years, but for 30.
And I'm sitting back in the Marshall cell block with another agent, and I sit down, and he says, where do you want to start? And I said, why don't you just start from the beginning? He says, well, back in 1972 was my first robbery. And I went, I says, hold up. I says, don't start there. It caught me completely off guard. Don't start there. Why don't you start when you were a little kid?
Carl's parents met after World War II. Both were refugees at a displacement camp in Germany. Carl's father had been a mechanic for the Russian army.
And Carl's father met his mother in a displacement camp right after World War II. She was from Armenia. He was Russian.
Carl was born at the camp in October of 1947. He and his family emigrated to the United States in 1954. Eventually, they settled in the suburbs of Philadelphia, where Carl's father opened his own car repair shop that grew into a successful business. But life wasn't easy for Carl, who early on exhibited a high intelligence, a relentless curiosity, and a thirst for adventure. He didn't fit in with his peers, and he butted heads with his father, who was a strict disciplinarian. The thrill-seeking 15-year-old engaged in a string of burglaries, which then culminated into a solo robbery of a candy store.
He's 15 years old, and him and a bunch of kids from the main line, they're walking down and they see a school window open, and they break into the school, and they steal a couple of musical instruments. I think one was a saxophone and one was a trumpet. And they take those to a pawn shop and try and pawn them to make some money. The pawn guy knows that they're stolen. He calls the cops. The cops come and get him. They take him back to the police station. They call their parents. All the other parents, except Carl's, they pay a fine and they take their kids home. Carl's father, so his father said to the police, he's going to pay for what he did, whatever it is. I'm not helping him out. So they put him in a juvenile hall for the summer. And so his whole summer is he's in a juvenile hall. So he gets out of the juvenile hall to start school. And what he starts doing is he starts doing burglaries. He's going into homes. He's going into the shops. And he hits a candy store. And a Havertown police officer gets the call. He gets there. He sees Carl running. He tells him to halt. He doesn't. He fires his gun and hits Carl in the rear end. Carl goes down. He's captured. Then he goes to Camp Hill.
Carl served 8 months at the juvenile facility. He was released in 1964 and went back to his high school for his junior year. And it was there that he had a conversation with his school guidance counselor that would change his life.
He comes out of Camp Hill. He goes to Haverford High School, which is a school in the upper middle class Philadelphia in the main line. She said, this is going to follow you the rest of your life. You'll never be able to get a job. You're going to have to work twice as hard as everybody else. But that stuck with him.
Carl internalized this on a deep level. On the one hand, he worked really hard in high school to bring up his grades to get into a good college despite his past. But what his counselor said, that no matter what he did, his juvenile record would always hold him back for the rest of his life. He believed it, even though it wasn't true.
He never realized that your juvenile record, okay, is not expunged, but it's not taken into consideration after you turn 18, unless you're going for some sort of classified position.
Carl graduated in 1966, and he received a partial scholarship to the prestigious Villanova University in Philadelphia, where he worked hard and earned a degree in electrical engineering. After that, in the summer of 1971, he enlisted in the Army, but in the back of his mind, he worried about his juvenile record.
He doesn't go in as an officer. And the reason why he doesn't go in as an officer, now he's got a degree in engineering from Villanova, but he goes in as a non-com, which is just a regular guy going in, when he could have went to Officer Candidate School. And the reason why he didn't was because in order to be an officer, they do a background investigation.
The bias he had against himself continued to fester, even as he pinned his hopes on a special weapons program assignment. He'd been singled out for it based on his intelligence and work ethic. He just had to clear a comprehensive security clearance.
He applies for a special weapons program that he wanted to get into that would have kind of elevated him a little bit. And they really liked him because of his computer skills and his skills as an engineer and all these things. They thought, why is this guy an officer? So he was in the front line for this. And he thought, I have this if I get past the background. And he didn't get it. So his thought process, the reason why I didn't get it was because of my juvenile record. That was his thought process. So that confirmed what he thought all along.
According to Ray, there was nothing in his military record to confirm Carl's belief that he hadn't made it into the program because of his juvenile record. But in his mind, Carl was convinced he had been rejected because of it, which confirmed his belief that no matter what he did, he would always be rejected because of his juvenile record.
He never thought, his whole thing, when I talked to him, he says, I never knew that my juvenile record wouldn't be used against me. I always thought that that was hanging over my head. And that's the real main reason why he did what he did. You know, he was a different type of individual.
Which is why, in the summer of 1972, when Carl was 25 years old, he was stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina when he read something that would change his life.
He's sitting on base and he was looking at the newspaper. Wow, this guy just got $80,000. He robbed a bank and the bank lost $80,000. That's in 1972. So you think $80,000 in 1972. I know my parents bought a house in Jersey for $29,000 in 1970. My dad came back from Nam. They bought a house, and for that. So I'm thinking that's a lot of money. Figure $72,000 today is probably 10 times that. So, he's sitting there. He goes, "Wow, I could do that."
Carl became obsessed. If society wouldn't forgive him for his past transgressions when he was a teenager, what choice did he have? After reading the article, whenever he went to the bank to deposit his paycheck or make a withdrawal, he studied the activities inside the branch, like an operative would in the battlefield, identifying weaknesses to exploit and pitfalls to overcome, tracking employees and customer movements, scoping out the entrances and exits. During these conversations, Carl shared with Ray how the thrill of robbing a bank had turned into a fantasy, one that he kept replaying in his mind over and over again. As a profiler, Ray saw traits in Carl's journey towards serial bank robbing that mirrored similar patterns of serial killers and rapists. The first thing was fantasizing about it. The next step was the act itself. In this case, Carl robbing his first bank, his process of selecting the target, and his plan for committing the crime. The third step would be the disposal of evidence, to either leave the items behind at the scene, to keep it with him, or to hide it. Carl told Ray that he stole some guns from a pawn shop and then buried them in the woods.
He gets early discharge. He's got these weapons. He steals a car right? He takes it and parks it in long-term parking at the airport, right? And he leaves it there.
Carl wasn't ready to rob a bank yet. In fact, he'd been discharged from the military in March of 1973 and moved back to Philly, where he lived with his parents. More than a year later, in the summer of 1974, he drove from Philadelphia back to Fayetteville, North Carolina. He was ready. In fact, he planned to hit the same bank that he'd read about where that robber had gotten away with $80,000. And the car that he'd parked at the airport, the one he'd stolen more than a year before, it was still there. He dug up the gun that he'd buried in the woods, the one that he'd stolen from the pawn shop. And he drove to the bank. He had a mask, gloves, and a hat. He was wearing baggy clothes. He had everything he needed to rob the bank. But as he sat in the parking lot, despite all of his preparation, he'd lost his nerve. He took the stolen car back to the airport, parked it, and drove his car back home to Philadelphia. Carl repeated the process the following weekend. And again, he sat in the parking lot of the bank, unable to do what he came to do, rob it. He proceeded to go through the same motions. He returned the stolen car to the airport and drove back home. For the third week in a row, he drove back to Fayetteville, this time completely disgusted with himself. He knew he had to do it. And this time, he did. He went in wearing the mask and said something to the effect that this was a stick-up. He removed the cash himself because he thought he could do it more quickly than the tellers, and then he fled out the door and into his getaway car. He drove back to the airport, got into his car, and started driving home. He had gotten away with $20,000, and he didn't get caught. Even so, Carl felt like he'd failed.
And it takes him 6 different times to come down to rob this bank before he gets the guts to do it. So I said to him, I said, what was going through your mind when you were doing this? He says, I fantasized about what it would be like to rob the bank going in and what it would be like and how it would. And I fantasized about everything. And I said, well, how did the reality, did it live up to the fantasy? He says, no, there's nothing like what I fantasized. And that's exactly what serial killers say. You know, they say that I fantasize what it's going to be like to do this to a person, but the fantasy doesn't live up to the reality, so they continue to kill. It's almost like going for that first high.
Carl felt unsatisfied, even though he was going back home with enough money to finance an advanced degree, because he'd been accepted into a program at the University of Pennsylvania, where he began work towards a master's degree in systems analysis. He also joined a club where he honed another skill, orienteering. It's a sport where you're able to find your way to various checkpoints in the wilderness using only a map and a compass. Learning to read topographic maps helped him find streams, abandoned railroad tracks, and trails. And after 8 months, he decided he was ready to rob a bank again. He needed the money, but Ray believes he was also chasing that high. So he stole another car and hit the same bank in Fayetteville. But this time, things didn't go as smoothly. While in his getaway car, a dye pack exploded in the bag, diffusing toxic chemicals inside the car. He was barely out of the parking lot, and he almost passed out. He quickly rolled down the window and stuck out his head for fresh air. And that's when he saw a police car racing down the street toward the bank that he'd just left. That's when he came to the realization that the only way to successfully rob banks long-term was to lean into his military training, to utilize his expertise at map reading, as well as his wilderness survival and special forces training in surveillance, patrolling, and strategy. For the next 30 years, Carl approached each bank as if he were a special operative conducting a patrol raid, where the bank was his target, and the objective was to get in and get out with as much money as possible within 2 minutes. The first step was choosing the right target. The branch had to be in a rural area near the woods and next to a main road. Once the bank was identified, he scoured maps related to the bank and surrounding area. Then he'd scout out the woods near the bank, where he would dig a temporary bunker to hide his weapon, mask, gloves, satchel, and clothes ahead of the robbery. After that, he conducted surveillance on the bank, tracking customer and employee movements. And finally, on a selected Friday, Carl parked his van 10 miles away from the bank at a random apartment or shopping complex. He opened up the van's cargo doors, drove the motorcycle off the ramp, locked up the van, and proceeded to ride his bike until he was 2 miles away from the bank. He then off-roaded into the wilderness where he stashed his bike, then walked on foot to his bunker, got on his gear, and made his way through the forest toward the bank. He waited until just a few minutes before closing time and sprinted near the bank's entrance. And then it was go time. He donned his Halloween mask and in full disguise rushed into the bank, vaulted over the counter, and went down the teller line, stuffing cash into his open bag. And within 2 minutes, he was gone. He then reverse engineered this process, went back to the woods, stashed the money, gun, clothes, and satchel in the bunker, walked back to his motorcycle, hopped on and drove it to his van, and then went home. He wouldn't go back to the short-term bunker that was near the bank for at least a few days, and in some cases, months. Later, he would add these items to his long-term bunkers. And according to Ray, during Carl's confession, he had a lot of bunkers.
How many caches did he have that you guys found? You found the one in the cave, the one with the two boys that were building the fort. How many other ones did you find?
In total, we found 27 bunkers.
How far apart were they?
New York, Albany, Connecticut, Jersey, Delaware, Virginia,
And
Maryland.
you were able to find these because he had maps of them inside the bunkers?
He had maps of them, and later on, he told us where some of the ones were that we didn't even know about.
Okay, so before, though, you guys had, how many did you have before he told you about the ones that you didn't know about, just like in general?
We had probably about 14.
Over 30 years, Carl Gugasian robbed around 50 banks for more than $2 million. And as far as his sentencing, because of his confession, incredible insights of bank security, strengths and weaknesses were revealed. Carl would also go on to appear in a training video for law enforcement and bank employees about improving bank security and protocols. As a result of his cooperation, a judge reduced Carl's sentence from more than 100 years to 17. Carl Gugasian served his time and was released from prison in 2017.
I says, here's the opportunity for you to turn your life around. What you did is in the past. It's all bad. Now you can start doing good. I said, find something you can do that's good. And I visited him when he was over in Fort Dix, prison over in Fort Dix, over in Jersey. He said he was teaching GED to prisoners. He was a math whiz. And he's doing the same thing now. He's teaching people that didn't finish high school and things of that nature. And he's teaching them to get their GED and get college credits and things of that nature. He's a bright guy. He'll be 78 years old.
Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host, Brandon Morgan, and I discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.